Welcome to Kitchen Table Conversations, a series of short and shareable conversation starters for those of us who have or love and support people with a complicated and beautiful brain. Here's your host, Angela Geddes.
Hi everyone, and welcome to another edition of Kitchen Table Conversations. I'm your host, Angela, and I'm just so excited to be able to say that while this podcast is being launched, I am on my way to St. John's, Newfoundland for the very first time, and I'm going because I'm going to be presenting with my friend and colleague Tanya at a conference that's called Reducing Harms in Atlantic Communities, Synthesizing Voices in Health Equity, FASD, and Trauma. And this conference zooms out of the narrow FASD-centered lens to capture any and all potential domains and factors that contribute to alcohol use and culture, addictions, mental health issues, trauma, and all kinds of things that impact psychological and emotional health and neurodiversities, including FASD, in our communities in Newfoundland and Labrador and Atlantic City, and obviously more broadly. If you've been listening in and if you know me at all, you know that I have been saying for a very long time that fetal alcohol spectrum disorder and or the impacts of prenatal alcohol exposure impacts all of us. We all know somebody who is struggling with the consequence of prenatal alcohol exposure. And as I've often said too, you know, the statistics are very clear that 80% in our culture today here in Canada, 80% of women in childbearing years consume alcohol, and over 60% of pregnancies are unplanned. And there continues to be a lot of mixed messaging around what is safe and what is considered prenatal alcohol exposure. And I can tell you that when asked the question, most people do not consider any alcohol use prior to the confirmation of the pregnancy. And that's a pretty significant area of development that needs clarification. And again, that's the whole point of this kitchen table conversation, is because I'm really hoping that what we talk about today will go back to your kitchen tables and you will be able to share this really important information. And the reason why I think today's topic is so critical is because there's still so much misinformation out there, but I think everybody's going to be really surprised to know that actually more people are consuming alcohol during pregnancy now than they were 10 years ago. And that to me is pretty surprising, but also I'm not really sure how to word this, but I suppose there is a level of frustration, but there's just a level of real concern, because I'm not sure that people understand how difficult it is for some people to experience, everyday ups and downs because they have been exposed to alcohol, and their ability to deal with, life's experiences are just that much more compromised. We are seeing an increase in mental health conditions. We're seeing an increase in anxiety, depression. We're certainly seeing an increase in ADHD. We're seeing an increase in neurodiversity and autism spectrum disorder. That spectrum has really broadened quite significantly over the last few years. But yet, the acknowledgement of the role that alcohol plays in some of these neurodivergent conditions is still very much minimized. And that's, I suppose, for a lot of reasons, not the least of which is our culture's desire to continue to engage in alcohol use. And also, if I may, I just read an article yesterday talking about the new drinking guidelines and how there is resistance from government because alcohol brings in a significant amount of tax dollars that pays for a lot of the things that we as community members and taxpayers appreciate. So there's definitely, more conversations that need to be had, but I just can't help but think that if we did act more responsibly when it comes to alcohol use, and if we were sharing more accurate and real messaging, yes, we may see a reduction in the sales and the tax dollars that come with alcohol sales, but we might see a reduction in hospital expenditures, mental health concerns, school board expenses that require extra supports and services for kids and youth with complicated and beautiful brains. So this definitely is a conversation that needs to keep happening. And I'm really loving that the Newfoundland conference is broadening their audience and not necessarily focusing on FASD. And I've been saying that for many years also. And I think that this is so important because people who understand FASD. But what we're missing and what I see so pointedly clear on a daily basis is that it's the people who are struggling and who are kind of bouncing back and forth from the Charmin padded guideposts of life that do struggle with relationships, that do struggle with mental health, that do struggle with academic achievement, do struggle with keeping and maintaining employment and keeping and maintaining relationships, and who continue to try so very hard but yet don't reach their potential because they don't understand their complicated and beautiful brain, and they're not given the kind of supports that will help them thrive. That's the audience that we need to see. We need to help people who are going for mental health supports understand that maybe what we're seeing is beyond mental health and beyond parenting experiences and beyond potentially traumatic experiences, and maybe directly linked to interference in development prenatally as a result of alcohol and other substances. So this is a really, really big deal. And if you haven't heard before, I think it's really important to remember that fetal alcohol spectrum disorder is more prevalent than autism spectrum disorder, cerebral palsy, Down syndrome, and Tourette's syndrome combined. So this is really, really important information, and I challenge each and every one of the listeners to continue to share that information and share that statistic. Not because we want to take away the interests and the supports that are received by individuals who are on the autism spectrum disorder or who are experiencing Tourette's and cerebral palsy and Down syndrome. Obviously, all of those complex neurodevelopmental conditions require supports and understanding. But given the proper and more accurate information and really supporting pregnancies from the very, very beginning and even pre-contemplative stages, I mean, we can just literally change the landscape in a very short time period. FASD is the leading cause of neurodevelopmental disorders. And what I also think is lost or maybe not really fully understood is that fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, or even the effects of alcohol, can be carried forward to our children even if we're not consuming alcohol. So in other words, if my mother drank alcohol during her pregnancy and I was experiencing concentration difficulties, maybe difficulties with math and maybe some mental health challenges, but ultimately I'm managing through life, not without some pretty significant challenges, but I'm managing. Those traits can be passed on to my own children, who can then be compromised, even if I don't consume alcohol. So the DNA that's been passed forward to me then gets passed forward to my children. So I find this, this has been so fascinating in terms of epigenetics and understanding the father's role in the baby's development, and really trying really hard to reduce the stigma attached to alcohol use within this current pregnancy, for example. So in other words, the effects of alcohol and the effects of trauma, we know that the effects of trauma are intergenerational, and we also know that the effects of alcohol exposure is also intergenerational because it does change the DNA. So I know of people who are, themselves, they have been exposed to alcohol prenatally. They do struggle. They don't have a diagnosis because, let's be clear here, most people who do struggle with the impact of alcohol exposure will never get a diagnosis because they aren't recognized. We are not equipped to screen and assess as we should be, and we don't have the capacity to assess everybody in need right now. So that's a bigger conversation, but that's something that I think everybody needs to know. There are many, many people who are 1.8 million people in Canada alone that would qualify for a fetal alcohol spectrum disorder diagnosis today. And when I did my most recent research, which was back in 2016 and 17 when I was finishing my thesis, in Canada, according to the Canadian guidelines and with multidisciplinary teams, we had the capacity at that time to assess a little over 2,000 a year within that multidisciplinary team approach. So although that's what we all need and what people need in order to get an accurate understanding of how their brain works and what their areas of strength and what their areas of challenge are, that's not accessible for many, many people. We don't have, as I said, the capacity, and a lot of the assessment services cost quite a bit of money. So there's a lot of people that are walking around with FASD, but will never know it. So I think that's really important. But again, these people are, partnering up and having families of their own, and their kids are struggling with complicated mental health and learning challenges that are directly and indirectly related to prenatal alcohol exposure. So these things are really, really important for us to understand because we can really make a difference in terms of prevention. So again, I do encourage these conversations to go back to our kitchen tables, and then also recognize that we all have a role to support healthy pregnancies within our own communities and at a broader level. So if we have an opportunity, if you work in radio, for example, let's help spread the word. So the conference that I'm actually participating in and presenting in Newfoundland this week focuses on reducing the stigma and helping people to understand the challenges that people with complicated mental health and learning conditions experience and neurodiversity experience on a regular basis. And one of the things that we're talking about is, who needs to know this information? And the bottom line is everybody needs to know it because FASD is in all of our circles. But people with FASD are often met, and people with any kind of neurodivergence are often met with confusion and judgment and frustration and anger, and oftentimes people with puzzling presentations and puzzling behavior get kind of pushed aside and judged pretty harshly. And so our conference and our workshop in particular is meant to help raise awareness and to help us do our part to reduce that kind of thing. Because instead, people who are experiencing brain differences and in some cases brain damage, they should be met with compassion, with patience, and with support. Naturally, if we think about somebody who was in a car accident, for example, they've had an external brain or a traumatic brain injury, everybody in their circle knows that if their executive functioning is off, if they're not able to plan, if they're not able to function quite as well at school or within relationships, and if they can't hold a job down, we get that. And we wrap around, and if it was a car accident, for example, they will be financially supported because there's been an insurance policy that's going to help them access some of the supports that they need. But I'm here to tell you that alcohol exposure prenatally results in brain trauma and brain injury. But we don't see that quite the same way, and certainly not as definitively. So that needs to change. And again, car accidents, Mothers Against Drunk Driving, for example, have done tremendous work and advocacy to reduce alcohol use while driving because it results in injury and death. And I just really kind of wish that we would have the same sort of advocacy and publicity around the risks associated with consuming alcohol when there could be a pregnancy. People are really struggling, and there's always a really interesting balance between helping people to identify the strengths, and there are gifts, and let me tell you, there are really beautiful gifts. People with FASD are some of the most resilient, hardworking, kind, tolerant, loving, supportive, creative, and brilliant individuals that I've ever met. However, on the other side of that is a very busy mind that ruminates, that works harder than any of us neurotypical people have to do, that need, when they work for a couple of days, they need decompression time, they need rest, they need reassurances, they struggle socially and financially. I just, I've met in the last week people who have wondered why life is so hard, why their mothers or their parents drank so much, and they're angry about that because of how difficult their life is. I've had people say to me, why wasn't I aborted? And I think that everyone needs to stop and listen to that for a moment and think about what that really means. And this is not just once that I've heard this. When people come into my support services, they come in because they've been struggling for years and years and years, and life gets very tiring, and life can be hard for all of us. But it's not the same when you're stigmatized, when you're isolated, when you're misunderstood, when you ask for help and you don't get it, when you don't qualify for the help that you do deserve, when you are constantly confused about why people are not understanding you and why your recollection of a situation is so different than somebody that you love and care about. So anyways, life is very complicated, and again, people with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, or people who have experienced the impact of prenatal alcohol exposure, are lovely, wonderful people that continue to teach me things every single day, and I'm so grateful for the role that I get to play in walking alongside people. But I also see that this is a real struggle, and families are breaking down, and families are really, really at risk, and we as a system need to do things differently, and again, with the proper information, with accurate information, with the proper supports, outcomes can be so, so different. So again, I encourage you, please take this kitchen table conversation episode back to your kitchen tables And I so appreciate the time that you spend with me. And I hope that you find this meaningful, and I really hope that you continue to spread the word. Again, when I'm thinking about, the conference that we're going to here in Newfoundland, one of our slides is specifically around who needs to hear this. And as I said before, everybody needs to hear it. But people who are working in radio, people who are working in TV, I've had people say to me, why do we not have commercials when the Super Bowl is on? Why do we have commercials for popcorn or beer or, favorite restaurants? Why do we not have commercials about some of the risks associated with alcohol use in pregnancy? This can literally be a game changer, and I encourage us all to think about that for a little bit. So a lot of the work that I continue to be engaged in, whether it's my direct services or whether it's education and training materials, it's all meant to increase awareness and to build system capacity so that there are fewer wrong doors and that we together can reduce both the impact and the incidences of prenatal exposures such as alcohol and other illicit substances, because I do believe that it's up to all of us to support healthy pregnancies. And again, this can be a real game changer. So I encourage you to check out my website and there's a variety of different websites out there, and there's a ton of information and a ton of research if you want to learn more about fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. But I do think that it's important to note that there's lots of training opportunities. The Ontario government has supported training opportunities for general, service providers in Ontario, and CanFAS, which is the Canadian FASD Research Network. They have a ton of resources and amazing training opportunities as well. And I have just recently participated in some assessment team training, which is available through our Fetal Alcohol Spectrum Disorder Ontario Network of Expertise website. So that's going to be available very soon for the second round, and it will be ongoing for anybody who's interested in building their skills and capacity in assessment services and being a part of a multidisciplinary team process. And I have just launched training that's specific for social workers or frontline practitioners who engage in assessment services within their scope of practice and within mental health services. Because as I said, people who are accessing mental health services are at much higher risk of being exposed and to to prenatal alcohol exposure, and therefore maybe what we're seeing is a little bit more than mental health issues and mental illness. So we as social workers play an integral role in supporting individuals who've been affected, and we can do a better job of screening and assessing within our scope of practice and placing people on a path to more helpful and relevant support services. So we do have this training available. So check out the website for that. We also have some new programs and workshops available for young adults who have or are suspected to be impacted by prenatal alcohol exposure or fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. We have some workshops, and we've just launched them, and the first one was like a ton of fun, and the feedback so far has been excellent. So again, check out my website, angela@angelageddes.ca, and again, once again, thanks so much for tuning in. I just really appreciate this opportunity to share what I've learned and to continue to have this conversation going. With many thanks, Angela.